Hi, I'm Barclay Bram, and I am a fellow of Chinese Society here at ASPE's Center for China Analysis. And today we're really happy to bring you a webinar on seeing the other China, AI beyond DeepSeek and chips. So, as we know, most media coverage of AI in China, in the West, that we see is all about, the arrival of DeepSeek, semiconductors, US-China rivalry. But today, I'd really love to focus instead on how AI is actually being used by people in China and how AI technologies interface with the specific conditions of the Chinese internet, such as the platform economy, integrated digital payments, and the surveillance censorship apparatus. And today, we have a really amazing set of panelists. So we have Yi-Ling Liu, who is the author of Wall Dancers, which is an amazing new book about the Chinese internet. We have Jessica Batke, who is a senior editor for investigations at ChinaFile. And we have Afra Wang, who is a writer and a researcher. So I'm really happy that you guys could all be here today. And I'm going to start off by throwing a rather huge curveball question to you, Ealing. So you've just written this really amazing book, Wall Dancers, which I was very lucky to read a proof of and thoroughly recommend. Could you give us, in very short, brief way, a kind of potted history of the Chinese internet and what makes the Chinese internet different to the internet elsewhere? Because that will sort of ground our discussion now on AI and how that is kind of changing things.
Thanks so much, Berkeley, for the introduction, and glad to be on this panel with you all, and for the huge question that you just threw at me. I'll try to be as succinct and concise as possible. But essentially, the Chinese internet in many ways started out very much like the World Wide Web, kind of what I think of as a romance. The early internet would be a space that's open, free, exploratory. China first logged on in the 90s. People believed that the internet was going to liberalize China. Bill Clinton said that trying to control its spread was like, quote unquote, nailing Jello to the wall. Of course, the key difference between the Chinese internet and the World Wide Web at the time, and that persists to this day, is that like in 1997, the party started building this online censorship apparatus that we now know as the Great Firewall, letting things in that would allow for innovation, ideally, and keeping things out that would bring about instability. And what happens is that over the next several decades, within the bounds of the firewall, grows as an entirely alternate ecosystem. And so, today, to step into the Chinese internet is to step into an entirely parallel online universe, right? You have WeChat instead of WhatsApp, Didi instead of Uber, Alibaba instead of Amazon, and now, like DeepSeek instead of ChatGPT. And it also became clear that China could actually nail Jello to the wall, right? Censorship tightened, liberal influencers are scrubbed off the internet. The Great Firewall expanded to a much more kind of sophisticated system of surveillance. And this kind of movement from openness to closure is happening not just in China, but all around the world. And this is the kind of, I guess, environment that the world is now being swept up by generative AI and this very like closed and siloed online environment.
Mm, yeah, for sure. I think about that quote a lot, nailing Jello to the wall. It's so evocative, but unfortunately, yeah, quite successful. And that is something that you've obviously looked at, Jessica. So recently you wrote the Locknet, which is this amazing investigative report into how China censors its internet. So could you kind of explain to us a bit about that metaphor and how now AI is sort of interacting with the Locknet?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here with the two other panelists who I admire greatly. Yeah, we called it the locknet, my co-author and I, not as in a lock and key, but as in like a system of locks, so it can raise and lower water levels in an artificial lake. We like this metaphor better than the Great Firewall because a wall is static, it doesn't change, it's in the same place, and it implies that it's mostly checking traffic that comes across the border. But as we know, China's overall online censorship system is so much more dynamic and so much more, it's so much bigger than just checking foreign traffic that's coming across the border. So we likened it to a system that like can raise and lower direct channels of water. Just change the flow and circulation of things. So that's why we called it the locknet. But talking about how AI is integrated into the locknet, how AI is affecting censorship online. The censors are making good use of AI to take off content that they consider illegal. And there's two main ways that they do this. One is that AI technologies help filter out content that users are putting online. So there was an amazing interview that the online magazine Mang Mang did last year with a content moderator that's working at a large Chinese tech company. And that content moderator noted that the AI is doing the first line review of content. So a user types something into a chat, onto a platform, and the AI is the first thing that sees it. No human sees it. The AI is making the first line decision. Should this go up? Should it not go up? And it'll delete things or not let things be posted. So sometimes a human reviewer never will see it. But then it does pass on certain questionable pieces of content it's not sure about. So there is a second line human review. And I will just say we should anticipate that there will continue to be humans in the loop. We should not anticipate that humans will be completely excised from this. But the second way that AI is contributing to censorship online is because large language models and the chatbots that run on them, like DeepSeek, they have to produce content that abides by these censorship rules. And so developers have to build censorship into these models. And there's two ways that they can do that. They can do that during what's called the pre-training phase. And so that encapsulates everything from what training data you're going to feed in to actually running creating the model. And then you can do that also in the post-training phase. And you might have read stories about where someone types a query into DeepSeek, it'll start to print an answer, and then it deletes the answer that it just printed. And that's because someone has bolted on this additional technology in the post-training phase that basically all it does is check the outputs. It's another AI program that checks the outputs of the first AI program to see if it's okay, and if it's not, it deletes it. So those are the two main ways that AI is helping censors right now. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
But I think what's really amazing about your metaphor of the locknet is it captures the fact that the Chinese internet is still a really dynamic place. And so, I think this perception, exactly as kind of Yi-Ling mentioned as well, that the Chinese internet, because, that people had this perception that you can't close down an internet system. And I think that is true, actually. What you prove in the locknet is that you can't shutter the system, but you just have to reroute and direct these flows. And so the Chinese internet is still this very dynamic place. And I think now, as AI is taking off and becoming a much bigger facet of the Chinese internet, the way that those flows are channeled and the dynamism that is still present is, in and of its own way, a kind of really unique, interesting development. And Afra, you spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley and also looking at the Chinese internet. So between these two different cultures, what do you hear from people when they look at the Chinese internet and the developments of AI? How is it being understood between these two worlds?
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here with the great panelists, Jessica and Yi-Ling, whose work I deeply admire. Going back to your question, Barclay, I think just from a really ground level, from the making money perspective, it's a big difference between Silicon Valley and China. There's no SaaS culture in China. People don't have the default behavior of paying for AI services. So software is free has been a major blocker for a lot of AI companies to monetize in China. So as a Chinese investor and as a Chinese entrepreneur, what do you do in this kind of market, right? So you either you develop a fundamental different business model than China, and then you sell your product to the overseas market, to the European and the US users, because that's where the money is. Or there's another consequences could be some really good funding team are increasingly serving the US market and then will eventually relocate. So this actually has been a concern. I've heard of discussion, from Chinese entrepreneur Luo Yonghao, Zhou Hongyi, Li Xiang, the founder of the Li Auto. They all sort of expressed a concern about, what should we do? if there's no money out there. And their expectation is eventually we will need to build this paying for service, paying for software sort of consumer behavior. And I think another major difference is the capital structure difference. So in the US, the ABCD round for fundraising is a very mature, clear, and transparent playbook. But it's not very symmetrical in China. So in China, I think the capital market has slightly low transparency, and there are a lot more basically state capital, such as 国投, state investment fund, and a lot of the foundational models are mostly funded by bigger companies and not relying on venture capitals. Yeah, these are some of my observations.
And that's really interesting. So when kind of founders go and approach these more kind of state-backed capital, are there more conditionalities based on the capital, or is it pretty like free reign?
Oh, well, I think in China the AI topology is a lot more different than the Silicon Valley's AI topology. You have what I observed, the 7 circles, which are basically interlocking circles, and then created a much bigger giant and state-backed ecosystem. So you have basically academic circles, you have bigger national labs, and the second circle is you have a big tech ecosystem such as Alibaba's Coin, Tencent's Hunyuan, and ByteDance Doubao, and you have a lot more industrial institutions, which create certain government-led standard bodies, and then you have large research institutes such as what we really are familiar with, Beijing's Zhiyuan Institute, Shenzhen's Pengcheng Lab, and then you have some pure open source organizations such as Open Atom Foundation, which is quite popular in China. As previously we mentioned, China has a big open source culture, and China has been a beneficiary for open source, the global open source community for over the past 20 years, which is also a product of what Yi-Ling said, the more romantic, free face of the internet. And then the 6 circles, you have startup and the investment circle, and then lastly you have the unique ecosystem built upon the rise of DeepSeek. So with the 7 interlocking circles, you create a topology which basically creates a different way of selecting talent, of funding talent, and building certain ecosystem, and create certain sustainable monetizable model. And yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. And Yi-Ling, I mean, we've spoken about this very briefly, but one of the things that came up in one of our recent conversations, which I found really interesting, was the registry of algorithms that exists in China, which I think is pretty unique compared to anywhere else in the world. And so I know you've been doing still very early research into this, but can you tell us a bit about this algorithm database and how are the algorithms being used?
Yeah, so in brief, the algorithm registry is a kind of governance mechanism. It's very similar to in the 2000s, they introduced a registry where all websites that are publicly available in China need to register, all blockchains need to register. By 2022, all recommendation algorithms need to register. And now, essentially, if you are creating any public-facing AI model, you could be a startup, you could be a big company, you could be a university lab, any one of these parts of the AI topology that Afra mentioned. If you are building that model, you need to submit an application, run a bunch of internal tests to the CIC, the Cyberspace Administration, and essentially go through a pretty opaque testing process. And if there's nothing wrong with your model, you are publicly listed on a PDF file on the CIC website. And so what's interesting about the registry is, on one hand, it's this fascinating governance mechanism that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. I think maybe the closest comparison is something like the EU-AI Act, which is still very much trying to find its legs. But from a just commercial perspective, and from a trying to make sense of China's AI landscape perspective, you essentially have a library, like an archive of every single AI application, like AI model that exists in China. Essentially, like some things slip through the cracks, but it's like if you were able to find every single person who's like created a large language model in the US, there's just like no comparative. So if you're a researcher, a writer, a journalist, that's like a fascinating resource because you can see, how many large language models are there being registered. Is healthcare a very competitive sector? The data set shows that it is. Trivium has done, it's a policy organization, think tank, and they have kind of scraped through all of the PDF files and put out this wonderful data set that's just been like, oh, well, education is really hot right now because we can see like X percentage of these hundreds of registered companies are education applications. So there's like a lot to mine there if you really want to delve into the PDFs.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yi-Ling, do you know if any non-Chinese companies have or plan to like try to register in China? This is just something I don't know.
Yeah, so I think there's something like 13 companies on there. And it's like really random. If you like Trivium has published this as well, it's also like all publicly available. And it's like Canva is on there, like KFC is on there, IKEA is on there, like really like yeah, I think Grammarly maybe. Yeah.
Wow, okay. So it's kind of like a flat pack furniture algorithm from IKEA. So
Yeah. But it's a very small percentage. It's like 0.5% of the
Yeah. And it's not any of like the big players that you think of when you think of people doing AI, large language models here. It's not ChatGPT. It's not, whatever. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. And as Yi-Ling just mentioned, there are obviously hot sectors, sort of education, healthcare. Afro, in your conversations with like entrepreneurs, what are the kind of sectors that they're looking at? What are people really interested in? Where do they see like the potential for AI to be really disruptive?
I actually have observed very, how to say, like a very vibrant dynamic. People are doing variety of things, which is a really great indicator of there's a bubble out there. But at the same time, I think from someone who works in Silicon Valley, I understand that bubble could sometimes means really good things, right? Because a bubble can greatly incentivize the founders to do the wrong thing. And eventually we will know what the right things to do. So back in my trip, to this August in China, I've talked to a lot of AI founders. One particular event I went to is actually for entrepreneurs who particularly building companies in China, but targeting the overseas users, Chuhai, right? Going overseas. And then these are the founders communicating with each other in the Silicon Valley growth language. So they are not necessarily playing the China consumer app language, but they're basically speaking the YC language. They're speaking Paul Graham's language. They're using, product market fit, growth hacking, user acquisition, user retention, such terms to describe, what they're doing. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. And I've also seen a lot of entrepreneurs, especially a lot of them I've talked to are building AI hardwares, spanning from AI glasses to like smart mirror. These are the items I've seen, by the way, and I've tried when I was visiting Shanghai Mosu Space, which is an AI innovator and an accelerator. I've seen a lot of those AI consumer hardwares, but essentially, I just feel like the AI on top of it is a very unnecessary layer of things. And, I've seen AI AC, which is the AI is plugged with, it's actually a product by Meidi. It's actually an AI plugged into some sort of DeepSeek large language model, but at the same time helps you to adjust to the best temperature for the room. But I don't understand like which part that DeepSeek plays in this AC. And the AI mirror is essentially a mirror that detects your the evenness of your sunscreen has been applied on your face. So things like that being manufactured in a massive scale, and I believe this is an indication of the unique Chinese characteristic on the AI industry is because China has this overcapacity of producing a lot of things. So you see a bunch of weird, useless, whimsical AI consumer products, but not necessarily translated into real needs. But I think the first group who are quite clear with where the money is, where the user is, which consumer are willing to pay, are going to be more or less challenging their Silicon Valley counterparts, competing market with them, and eventually maybe somehow alternate the playbook. So this is what I called in the future, Silicon Valley might need to touch China to cross the river, just because of this exact reason.
Wow, that's fascinating. And when these companies are looking abroad, because I've read, I've read some interesting reporting about kind of DeepSeek and some of these models which are free and pretty good, and how they're developing across the global south and emerging markets where people don't want to pay for like a premium product like ChatGPT 4 or some of the more recent models. So is that their vision of too high, or is their vision trying to break into America and competing against some of these more legacy like American products?
Okay, so I see another group of people I forgot to mention are actually the foundation model developers, the AI researchers, the ones who are working on a lot of the really advanced Chinese open source models. And I think these are the people who are more like the visionaries. And then they insist to open source their model is because, China for the few decades of tech competition has always been a catcher, has always been a second place. And open source is often the smart strategy for the catcher to play. So what I've seen is China is winning on the open source front is because one, there's no big AIs are to develop any open sourced model. Large language models are all Chinese open sourced large language model. And I think these are the models basically start to occupy people's mind and people's behavior. A few days ago, Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, saying they've been used Alibaba's coin. Is because this is compared to ChatGPT, compared to Claude, it's just much cheaper and much faster. And I know a lot of the US entrepreneurs are using Chinese large language models in a shadow behavior, like although they don't say they use them, but in practice they do employ those large language models. And there's an author and a writer on Substack who writes a great newsletter called Interconnects. His name is Nathan Lambert. He's also an AI researcher. Did a great analysis of the AI large language model, like the open source large language model usage on Hugging Face. And what he realized is the Chinese large language models market share is already basically on top, and then there's no basically a equivalent of US open model to really compete with, and this applies not only in developing countries, but even in places like Silicon Valley, even in places like Airbnb, it's happening.
Wow, that's amazing. And Jessica, I wanted to ask you, so I know you've done a lot of research into kind of more local governance issues, how how local governments are managing themselves in China. Have you seen any interesting applications of AI so far, or yeah, I mean, because we spoke a little bit about investment also into AI from some of these state funds. Have you seen anything interesting happening like on the ground?
It isn't something I've been following really closely. I know that you get the central government is encouraging local governments to use it. And so it sounds like I've seen reports about how it's being used for local police departments. And so they're using it in the way that you would think they would be using it in surveillance, in like surveillance, contacts, right? Helping find people's faces and in video and things like that. But also it sounds like a lot of report writing, which is good. Like if it can reduce red tape, I guess that's good. But I haven't seen anything that, again, I haven't looked at this closely. I haven't seen anything that's like super surprising about how it's being used. And
They're not
I
all
mean, I
buying
don't
the
know.
AI, they're not buying the AI powered air conditioning units.
I
But
mean, I
what
think
if the
about
police
this in the
station's the wrong
US.
temperature?
Yeah, I mean, it could totally be the wrong temperature. It'd be horrible. I just think about how it's going, like, in the US and elsewhere, which is like a year ago, we were all told we were all going to lose our jobs. And this was like the end times for white collar workers because it was just going to come, everything was going to happen. And bosses having people use it. And then now everybody's discovering, well, it actually takes more time because I have to go back and correct all the mistakes. And so I'm really curious. I mean, I just think I'm curious globally around the world how this is going to play out. I'm also very curious in China, like how it's going to end up playing out. Like it's a token prediction machine, right? Like it's a text predictor, so it has uses, but I think it's just going to take the humans that are using it a while to figure out like what are the good uses and what are the ones that are not going to work as well. Um, I had something else to say, which was just thinking about what Afra was saying about like some these models already having such a large market share abroad and being used. I've been doing some research looking at like localization of LLMs. So that just means like if you're somebody developing an LLM, how can you make it fit a new local community better, right? So first of all, it needs to speak the language of that user base, but also it probably should have some of like the cultural and social values put in so it doesn't answer like a horribly wrong and offensive answer if you ask it something, or just something really simple like what are the top 10 baby names, right? And like if you are in northern India, probably having like Steve and John come up is not very relevant. But I remember reading in a couple of these papers, it seemed like the models, if they were using base models developed in China, they seem to be better at this sort of localization. They seem to be better at translating across languages without, before you did additional localization steps. And so I just thought that was really interesting. I'm not really sure why that is. I don't know if anybody here has any thoughts about that, if it's due to the open source question, if it's due just, yeah, I don't know.
That's really interesting. Afra, do you know anything about that?
You mean the localization of large language model?
Yeah. And why Chinese models might be better.
Because it's free. I think you don't need to pay. I think that's one of the killer advantage. Yeah, actually going back to the weird AI usage between China and the US, I do read a really interesting piece which was published on China Talk. It is about why China has a lot more AI boyfriends and the US have a lot more AI girlfriends. I think that's I don't know, like I think there's something in there. And it's probably Yi-Ling's great book probably captures a little bit like that. Is like it's from the gender balance to people's attitude to marriage to the rise of feminist movement. There's something reflected through the AI usage. I think it's such an interesting phenomenon. And another thing I've observed is a lot of people, especially at the beginning of the DeepSeek's, the rising usage of DeepSeek, a lot of people are obsessed with fortune telling with DeepSeek, letting DeepSeek to read the Bazi, which the Bazi reading accuracy and the level of the satisfaction on the details of explanation is a lot higher than the counterparts such as Claude and ChatGPT. So I've used DeepSeek to test my bats, and I'm really happy with the result. And a few days ago, I also read another article, which is another really uncanny phenomenon, which is the fake AI, basically AI model live streaming for variety of from clothes to like just regular like day-to-day consumers product selling. So you have 24/7 tireless AI models trying things for you, and explaining things for you, and then basically communicate with you. I think the Chinese live stream, like Chinese real human live stream, is already something that's really obscure to a lot of Westerners, and especially to Western companies. It's really hard to copy this playbook. But I think AI is amplifying is amplifying people's dependency on those live streaming services from the online shopping market.
Wow, a few years ago, I actually got to witness a live taping of Via, who's one of the big like live streamers, and I went to her like live stream studio in Hangzhou, and it was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen because as you can, you guys can't see my legs, but when I went to see Via, like there were four people underneath the table, kind of throwing up, like, okay, so it's a duvet now, and then she'd grab the duvet, and then there'd be another guy, and oh, it's a fan, and then another person. And this went on. I mean, I was only watching for 4 hours, and I was so exhausted because of all of these people and all of these products, and it was just going. And I couldn't believe, and she didn't take, she didn't go to the bathroom. I didn't see her take a sip of water. So the fact that she could well be replaced by an AI makes complete sense to me, actually. And but yeah, sorry, Afra, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like in a sense, it like the way you just described this like condition of labor, the intensity of labor is actually a way of making human doing really repetitive stuff. And I honestly think having a AI to replace such laborious job is in a sense of course a destruction to those models, to the sellers, but also in a sense of liberation.
Mm. And this actually brings me to something I wanted to ask Yi-Ling. So you've been doing research into how people are using AI in service of their mental health and kind of replacing therapists with AI. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
For sure. I just wanted to jump in on 2 points that Afra made earlier. And Jessica, I'm like keeping track. There's so much good material here. But on the true high point, which I found interesting in live streaming, is that I recently was reading this report put out by TechBuzz China, and they were looking at all the kind of the top Chinese AI apps that are going abroad. And a large percentage of them are just like live stream influencer stuff, like Meitu, like correction of like hair and facial features, which I found fascinating. And there was, I think, one of the most popular, like highest revenue Chinese AI apps is an app called Picture This, which is specifically like a plant identification app. So like I would love for someone to look into why specifically a plant identification app is doing very well outside of China. And on the kind of like government usage front, I think that was an earlier question. I found some like interesting stuff on the registry. Like there's everything from like making the power grid more efficient to like the civil aviation like association in China has an algorithm. And I think the reason why the state is involved with that is essentially like collecting all this data on like tickets and flight times and making things efficient for people, is that all that data is like centralized. And so it's interesting, like when something is state affiliated, usually it's because that data is like pooled together somewhere nationally, which like was an interesting link. But yeah, back to mental health. Barclay, you probably have actually more to say on this given how much expertise you've developed on this topic. But I think what I found most fascinating is that there's like a blurry line between like mental health apps. So like they're marketed as like places that you go and you figure out like how to deal with depression, or they're like B2B apps that are like sold to schools to like do psychological assessments, and like payban apps or like companionship apps, which are sometimes often marketed as mental health apps, but are basically just companionship apps in disguise. And then I think actually, despite the kind of proliferation of these apps, most people aren't using them. Like most people, there's just like no money to be made in that space from what I've heard, because most people are just going straight to DeepSeek and being like, I'm really sad DeepSeek solved my problems. It's like DeepSeek or Doubao. Unfortunately, like there's just like not enough public literacy, both in China and the US and worldwide, to know that, when you're conversing with a large language model with a mental health problem, it's not, pre-trained on any type of data that is going to make it equipped as your therapist in any shape or form. But I would say, just going through Xiaohongshu posts, the overwhelming response to people using DeepSeek as a AI mental health tool is positive. People are like, oh, I used DeepSeek and talked to it and I cried and I was so sad and I felt so cathartic. And DeepSeek is like my best friend and butler, like rolled into one. And for every like 20 posts like that, there's one post that's like, don't use it, it's sycophantic.
I actually wanted to ask because like I've been reading so many things about how sycophantic, OpenAI just tried to roll back the sycophancy in its new edition, and then people got real mad and so put it back in. But I'm just wondering, like, is there a similar thing happening there? I'm sure everybody's been seeing the articles about people who like develop psychosis and like the guy who thought he had developed a brand new math, essentially. I just don't know if those sorts of things are happening in China.
Yeah, I mean, good question. I would love to know. Like, I'm sure it's happening. Like, sycophancy is definitely happening. I haven't read any news of like AI psychosis. It might just because when that comes up, people are ashamed to talk about it or it gets censored. But I'm sure if like we did a little digging, like similar things are happening. I just think like the profit structure and the kind of like incentives for engagement naturally allow for sycophancy. But I don't know, Afra, maybe you've seen like reports otherwise.
Yeah, I still think I first of all, I really love Yi-Ling's piece because it gives me a sense of how like postmodern, post-industrial the Chinese societies already is, especially among the people who have certain AI literacy. But I do think a large group of people in China do not have AI literacy. Like they uh they don't use AI. They don't really heard of AI, and then they don't know what this thing have anything to do with their lives. So what we see is like urbanates, well-educated people in the big cities, depressed, lonely, chatting with Doubao, chatting with DeepSeek. But I just feel like in a sense, because we're talking about the mental health issues and all the other social problems, but I feel like people who have the most severe mental sickness in China are not necessarily using AI to help them out, and then which is I think another set of problem. Uh, Going back to the mental health thing, I do think actually Bazi fortune telling is a sense that mental health help. And also a form of companionship because it gives you affirmation, it gives you some certainty of life, certain sense of control. Yeah, I think I honestly I'm not too optimistic about the AI companionship business model, like either in the US or in China, when Mark Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen says, oh, like, oh, human beings actually need 15 friends, but now you only have 3 friends. AI can help you out to give you, illusion of having more friends, and making you feel have more sense of value. I think I just feel like this whole picture is really grim. I recently revisited the 2013 movie Her, and I realized one is Her is like 10 years ago when I watched it, I thought it's a movie about technology. And today when I rewatched it, I realized this entire movie is about mental health. It's about human loneliness. It's about how to tackle the questions where you can only tackle as a human being with other human beings. It's about communication. So when I revisit this movie from the angle of this is 2025, the Her sort of reality has already happening in our lives. And I realized, no, this is not about technology. This whole movie is about everything else than technology.
That's so interesting. I mean, on the subject of these AI companions and kind of these big proclamations, I found it very interesting that Elon Musk recently, Grok now has this very erotic chatbot that they've rolled out. And then Elon Musk was like, no, 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 but guys, like, it's gonna be great for the birth rate. Just you watch. Like loads of people, like, they're gonna have babies, which I don't quite understand how this T-junction works, but I do think, in the context of China and this bigger issue, you do have, a very low birth rate, you have very low marriage rate, you do have really high rates of loneliness. Like, I do wonder how the development of these technologies, where people are so, people work very long hours, they're very stretched, and then they have this very easy form of companionship. It does go back to your point, Afra, about the movie Her, and that, you're right, it is that very touching, very human conversation that seems to be like dropping out of society. And I think, given this, what you said, like the postmodern nature of China, in a way, like I think these technologies interacting with some of these deeper social forces could potentially be, even more existential loneliness and drift, potentially.
Yeah, I have a feeling there's going to be like a huge push for AI for elder care and just like elderly companion bots. Just because like there's such a like top down as well as bottom up push to produce things for like the quote unquote silver economy. Like I think they're going to be like little plush. I was talking to a company that makes AI toys, which was also a little eerie. But the next step would naturally be like turning that toy into something that like a 70-year-old person can use.
For some reason, I'm envisioning an AI AC, but also a companion friend, but also AI toy, but also can adjust the temperature for your room according to your body condition. Anyway.
The AI toy company that I was talking to was kind of like, well, you know, we have this thing where like the child can tell the toy if it's sad because, parents aren't home and don't know what's going on with the
Mm,
kid. And then all of the chat logs with the child over the course of the week is like condensed into an emotional report, which the parent can then review at the end of the week. And you're just like, wow, from age like, I don't know, 3 onwards, you're introduced to this idea that your toy is listening to you. And like mommy is gonna like review what you said to the
no.
toy, which is just like pretty wild to me.
Yeah, what does that do to one's sense of
Yeah.
privacy at such a young age? Like there's nothing, I wonder if you feel like there's anything you can say to any object that won't be like reviewed later.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty chilling pretty chilling thought, I think. Someone please jump in with something less chilling.
Um, well, on the toy note, this is maybe I don't know if this is chilling. Um, like recently, like I'm curious how the Chinese public will respond. I don't know if you've seen this meme go around, but like it is still chilling. Sorry, but curious to hear how you
It-
can keep it
We're
both
we're we're
around.
we're in we're
Um,
the AI air conditioning has chilled everything at 2 degrees Celsius.
yeah.
So go go for it.
Well, it was big on Weibo, but like this father was posted a video of his daughter kind of like talking to her AI toy, and I think the off button broke or something. And so he was like, "Well, this is the last time you're going to talk to the toy." And she was just so devastated, and she was like, "I'm so sad. This is my last conversation with you." And the AI toy was like, "Don't worry. I'm going to teach you a new word, and the word is memory." And I'm like always gonna be in your memories. And then it shuts down, and this girl's just like sobbing. And it just sparked a really intense conversation in China because people were like, a lot of it was just like, the dad should get her a new toy. But a lot of it was like, that type of dependence and relationship is so foreign or just like so intensely alien to us, but maybe is going to be the norm for that generation. And if anything is probably going to happen at a kind of more expedited pace in China than I think the rest of the world, just given how open and embracing people are of kind of new technologies.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on that point and ask Afra about this, but it does seem like there is a more kind of techno-optimist outlook. It doesn't seem like the conversation in China is as pessimistic. And also you have this overlay on top of a very different culture in relation to privacy. I mean, as you were saying, Jessica, like, yeah, an AI toy is embedding very early into someone, into a child, the idea that you will be listened to, but the whole society is embedded at various levels with the idea that that you will be listened to, and privacy norms are very different. Even in the medical sector, the norms are very different. So I think on all levels, the technologies are interacting with very different cultural norms. So I was wondering, Afra, if how you're seeing those developments when you have your conversations, cross-culturally.
Well, I think as someone who went to Chinese elementary school, middle school, and high school, there's no such thing as privacy if you're a kid in school. Your private space is always being invaded. Your items will always be taken away. Because you're not allowed to have a smartphone at school. My iPhone 4 was taken away by my high school teacher. So like as a kid growing up in China, um, no matter if it's in school or in certain families, my parents do respect my boundaries, but I think privacy as a thing, it's just like it's really hard to establish your personal boundary. And then this is a thing. This is a thing happening in the workplace, happening in schools, happening in a lot of households. So I think that's a little bit like a grim sort of answer. But going back to the Barclay, you asked about the optimism and the pessimism. I do think in China, people are really chill about AI. The mass, the consumers, the AI researchers, they don't really freak out. There's not a lot of, ethical discussions or discussions about religion or discuss about, what AGI impose threat to the society. Like I don't find a lot of people in China, one, genuinely believe in AGI, and second, genuinely wanted to participate in the San Francisco coded timeline discussion, which is the discussion they want to talk about, not everything else. Because I was in one of the conferences where everyone wanted to talk about AI timeline, nothing else. I don't see a lot of Chinese tech people, Chinese AI researchers are obsessed with AGI. So this is what I call it. There's an AGI faith gap. Where if you hear AGI in China, it could semantically mean very different things. It could mean AGI applying everywhere, being diffused quite deeply into people's lives, but not necessarily this like inflection point, human in the cloud, super intelligence-ish imagination where, permeates the Western society. I generally think Chinese people are more adaptive and embracing new technology because in the past many years, 20, 40 years, technology has been giving people significant life improvement. There's a reason why, from the state to the people have more faith and hope and optimistic feeling about AI.
Do you?
Just want to, oh, Jessica.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, it's just, I think like, I think Afra and we've maybe like batted around some of these ideas before, but like why essentially like AGI rhetoric is so much stronger in Silicon Valley than it is in China. And like one theory that I think of like positive and has been thrown around is like AGI, the idea of super intelligence, the idea of singularity, this idea of like we're reaching this point of no return. This kind of like teleological point of no return is quite Christian. Like it's quite theological. It's quite like, and then the Messiah will come and like transhumanism, like this idea that we're gonna like meld into the robot world is also, I think, like rooted in like a Christian theology. And obviously people like Peter Thiel have like huge sway in pushing that narrative forward. And there's no equivalent in China. Like there's no, and then we're going to be saved and kind of like turned into like divine robots. And so like I think that idea is so foreign. But like there is this narrative that like AGI is being propagated in the US and China is focused on diffusion. I am curious to what extent that story is like it's fading, that there's going to be more people, when you're like looking over your shoulder, like I wonder to what extent Chinese people will be like, oh, we should probably start working on AGI. And like, Americans to a certain extent are now like, oh, we need to start like, Mark Andreessen is like, let's pump this stuff into our economy, or like China's gonna like outcompete us. So there may be some change in that narrative.
Yeah, actually, after Yi-Ling and we talked about this, I've been thinking this a lot more. I do think I totally agree with you that in the Chinese society, there's no sort of in the collective unconsciousness, there is no such mental anchor to really think about AGI as a inflection point where something is gonna transform this society so dramatically, which after crossing this point, everything will be so different. I think there's no such mental imagination in among Chinese people in the Chinese society. And going back to your point, I do see some Chinese entrepreneurs start to talk about super intelligence, start to talk about AGI, such as Alibaba's Eddie Wu, the CEO of Eddie Wu. I think a month ago, 2 months ago, he made a speech during its annual developer conference, one of the biggest conference that Alibaba does every year, which he delivered this China's first series, what I call evangelization of artificial superintelligence. So he, in a sense, was playing a prophet, which this role of playing a prophet was usually being played by Silicon Valley, not Chinese tech people themselves. But I think this is their first attempt to play the future prophet and then evangelizing artificial superintelligence. But the way I understand the speech is, one, it's absolutely marketing hype. It's beautiful marketing language. It's great. It's really effective for Alibaba stock price. It's great to encourage incentivizing is really alluring and encouraging. And then second is the way Eddie Wood describes how in his imagination this future superintelligence works is he used a very specific example, which is the future superintelligence will be able to connect to a ton of real world data and then be able to, let's say, manufacture a new car in a very fundamentally different way. Then you send 10 product managers to interview users and then create a prototype and then iterate. And he says, in the future, this human in the loop kind of interviewing, building prototype kind of steps will be emitted, and then superintelligence will take over, and then will use a much faster and more much smarter way to do such process, and then eventually build a very reliable and loving and functional and amazing car. And I think this example is so interesting because, one, I think it does anchor to China's manufacturing reality. It does anchored into the reality where, in the sense, AI could be deeply plugged into reality and getting a sea of real world data, and then be able to transform this data into meaningful results. And I think the third one is still, even though this whole speech is about artificial superintelligence, it still doesn't have the sort of the Demis Hassabis or Elon Musk kind of threat, right? Like when Elon Musk talks about AGI, when the doomers, San Francisco doomer groups talk about AGI, it's very different. Like they traded the AGI thing as something they absolutely couldn't control and don't have any confidence of controlling, but which the vibe is so different from Eddie Wu's expectation of ASI, artificial superintelligence. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel those things feel completely different. One of them is helping continue on a process that we know, right, and make it better. And another one is like claiming to change the nature of humanity itself. And I think I hadn't considered this idea of it being like this very religious sort of, our savior is coming. I actually really love this notion. It depends so much on ignoring the technical realities of what these machines are doing. Like if we really wanted to build an intelligence, I think we'd need to start from scratch. Like a token prediction machine is not, for just an example of an LLM, is not something that is like thinking or knowing things in the way that we understand that. I had something else to say and I just forgot. Oh, I also wonder how much I think the way that you guys have described this as like at the grassroots, at the people who are actually developing this technology are not thinking in these like apocalyptic end times AGI terms. But I also wonder to what extent that sort of narrative isn't going to be likely to be able to take widespread root because it doesn't seem like something that the Chinese government would love a narrative floating out around about this thing that's going to like completely alter human society in ways that no one can control, including the Chinese Communist Party. That doesn't seem like something that they would super love.
Yeah, so it could definitely be also like a top down. It could be like bottom up, nothing's brewing, and if it did brew, it wouldn't even get anywhere.
But earlier, Afra, you made this point right in the start. You talked about, the AI bubble. And so, with the fact that people, Chinese investors and thinkers are not talking about artificial general intelligence, are they talking about the bubble? Are they talking about the idea of it being a bubble? Because I think that is also, we have these two rhetorics, I think, in the West at the moment. You have the kind of Peter Thiel, and you have the kind of doomers, that, the coming of the Antichrist, this societal change that is coming because of AI. Or you have the other track, which is like this is all a sham and it's a giant bubble and the economy is about to collapse. We're about to wipe out $35 trillion of, personal assets, as the former head of one of the former head researchers of the IMF just said, what are those kind of conversations? Like where does that fit?
Well, first of all, I think one of the bigger discourse difference between China and Silicon Valley is I do think US has a lot more skin in the AI game, and China does not. In the third quarter, the US GDP bump is completely driven by the AI infrastructure building and the investment in the AI industry. And this doesn't reflect to China. So in a sense, AI is not as existential to China as to the US. And as for a regular person, like, if you are working in tech, you're young, you tend to be a retail investor on Robinhood, maybe owning some shares of NVIDIA or whatever AI stock is out there. But this also doesn't translate into a urbanate, well-educated person who works for ByteDance, also have some money to invest. But this person in China probably doesn't have a lot of meaningful way to invest in AI, or have even someone wants to have more skin in the AI game in China. The market wouldn't really allow it because Chinese stock market, as we all know, is not something you really want to be part of. So I do think this is a bigger difference where so to be straightforward, I think the bubble in the US in the AI world is much bigger than the bubble in China in the AI world. And what I see is the open source, the large language building teams are all well funded by the bigger company behind them. They're not really thinking about making money yet because this is not something they need to worry about yet. And more on the more practical level, you see a bunch of developers and AI entrepreneurs are building the apps like the plant identification app, which charges the US market for maybe like $10 a month. And those are the people building very utilitarian, practical, and useful things. And when they have a really strong sense of product market fit. So in those two circles, I do think they know where they are. They know what their place is. They know what the market look like, and they know how to situate themselves into the U.S. AI landscape. And I think at the same time, in the U.S., I remember maybe 2 months ago, I was reading about the entire OpenAI's revenue is equivalent to the revenue of Apple's AirPod. And yet, OpenAI's valuation and the amount of investment OpenAI received and the ambitious plan of OpenAI building so much data infrastructure, building so much data center, all this electricity infrastructure building are all part of the bigger, more ambitious AI plan, basically tied to the U.S. national destiny, is something I feel more obscure, and I'm actually just really looking forward to see what's gonna happen. To be clear, like I am I have a lot of skin in the AI game. I like to buy, a little bit stock here and there just because this will make me to care more, and I actually enjoy it.
Wow. Okay. So we're nearly out of time, and not to be an AI sycophant, a sycophantic AI, but this has been really interesting, and everyone has been really amazing. So I just wanted to ask whether Jessica and Yi-Ling, if you have some concluding thoughts.
It's not gonna be a nice wrap up, but just to build off Afra's earlier point, I think just given the different capital markets in the US and China, like in the US, you can build like one really cool prototype of a robot and make a huge amount of money just from VCs. And in China, you have to make like 200,000 of those robots, and they need to be actually being used. And by then you get like a fraction of the investment that you get in the US. So I think we're going to be seeing it more visibly in China in the years to come, because like hardware is going to be big. So my sense is like we'll be seeing the differences quite soon. That's just my
Wow.
yeah.
I love that. That's a great point. And Jessica, no pressure, but now you have to
No,
conclude.
I guess I would say I'm both more optimistic about AI in China and a little disappointed. So I'm not excited about the AI air conditioner. Like I just don't think that's great, but I am very thrilled that it seems like people have not jumped off the deep end on AGI. So like if I had to pick one of those paths, I'd go with the one that China's on.
That's amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. This has been an amazing discussion. Yeah. Thank you. This is really great.